Rolling. Yeah, I would like to go back to high school.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Really?
Your high school.
Right. When I was in high school, I'm almost a little bit embarrassed to tell you this. When I was in high school, I was an absolute political neophyte. The political world that was going on, one of the most contentious in the history of this country, barring wars, and I was as naive as you could be. 1968 was an incredible year. You had the Tet Offensive, you had the murder of Martin Luther King, you had the murder of Bobby Kennedy, you had the Democratic Convention in Chicago in August of 1968. The country was falling apart. In high school, I had good history teachers, very good, but they were just that, history teachers. There was very little effort that I remember made to link the past to the present. So Vietnam was a non-starter, despite the fact it was so contentious.
You mean they wouldn't teach it at that point?
Right. It was too new. It wasn't history.
Yeah.
So off I went to college, and in May of 1970, I was just finishing up my sophomore year when the Kent State debacle occurred and the announcement was made that people had been killed. Students had been killed. Unarmed students had been killed. It's a several-day event, what happened at Kent State. Richard Nixon went on television on Thursday night, April 30th, 1970, and gave a speech, had props, maps, pointed. There are these communist sanctuaries across the border in Cambodia. We're going to go in there and we're going to get rid of these caches of weaponry and bases that the Viet Cong and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, are using in Cambodia. And he ended that saying, this is not an invasion of Cambodia. Well, it didn't take much intelligence to realize that that was a blatant lie.
Yeah.
And that's what set off the sparks at Kent State University. Friday is a typical Friday. It's the end of the week. Kent State was typical of most schools in that lots of kids were there from the surrounding towns. Ohio's a big place with big cities, and lots of them would go home, but some stayed on the campus. And they went down to the bars on Water Street, which is not much of a walk.
It's May. It's getting nice.
It's May. The weather on May 4th was unusually nice. Dry, sunny, a beautiful day, and the weather was good leading up to that. And it ended up, there were some problems down there. There were some bonfires were started impromptu in the streets. The fire department had to be called. The police were called. No arrests were made. Saturday, somebody to this day, I don't know, and Alan Canfora's died fairly recently, and he went to his grave without knowing or without telling who actually initiated the events that became the burning of the ROTC building on the campus of Kent State. But that caused the Mayor Leroy Satram, President White of the university, and the Governor James Rhodes of Ohio collaborated, and the National Guard were sent in, as in the song Ohio, Tin Soldiers and Nixon Coming. We're finally on our own, references that. And Kent State University became a militarized zone. All rights and privileges guaranteed under the United States Constitution disappeared under the weight of martial law.
And that was, the governor had to declare that, right? And
the phone records now show that he'd been on the phone with Richard Nixon.
And he was running for office at the time. And I think because he could only do 2 terms, he had to go. So he was running for the Senate. And he thought that getting tough on these guys would be... Oh, it was in the primary. Anyway, he lost. And I think a lot of people said he lost because he said that the students were as bad or worse than brown shirts.
the essay, Hitler's notorious muscle arm during the Nazi era in Germany.
So he was saying that the hippies there were worse than Hitler's
Brown shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
as they were getting going. One other quick thing. Again, we're talking about the juxtaposition, the dichotomy. The National Guards people were playing Frisbee with students before it elevated.
Think of a tough situation. Here are these guys, essentially the same age as
Yeah.
the college students. Many of them who may have wanted to go to college but couldn't afford to, or the circumstances weren't right. So here they are put in that position. It's kind of like National Guard being nationalized in the Civil Rights Movement and put in between the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth and others. And perhaps their political beliefs are actually the opposite of that. Or maybe they're the same as that. And so you're right. There was a very friendly atmosphere as we turned the page to Sunday. And that was the day that several flowers went into rifles. And there was some taunting that day, too, though, that you may not know about. It was the era of, with some females, no underwear, no bras for sure. And some of the young girls had dresses on and nothing underneath, and a couple of them, at least, threw their dresses up, exposing their bodies and saying, come on back to my room and have some fun instead of, look what you're doing there with a gun. You're not going to use that gun. And so there was some taunting that went on.
They call them pigs. They call them the police pigs all the time.
All the time, yes. One of the weapons that the protesters had, the anti-war movement, was language. And so they could really cut into the authorities by calling them pigs constantly, over and over and over again. And many other abusive terms were used as a weapon. The only weapon, really, that people have if they're not with actual weapons.
That's like the N-word to police officers. I mean, they will go red instantly.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, they get pissed instantly.
Yeah. Who wants to be called a pig? Under any circumstances.
Yep.
You're a pig, G.
Yeah.
You're a pig. And I mean it. You're a pig.
Yeah. I mean, they're picking a fight.
They're hoping to provoke.
Yeah.
That's the purpose. Sunday night came, and at an intersection just off the campus, there was a disturbance. And a student climbed up on one of the overhanging streetlight fixtures and got stuck up there. And so the fire department had to come and get him down with a ladder, which they did. But as that scene developed, ultimately, a couple of people were bayoneted by National Guardsmen. So the situation had turned sour. You also had people students who were returning to the campus, and other than what they'd heard on the news, had no idea. They walked into an atmosphere. It would be like you walking into the TD Bank garden to a basketball game as a spectator. Now, you're listening to the game on the radio, so you know what's kind of going on in the game, but all of a sudden somebody throws a uniform on you and says, you're in the game now. And you go on in the game. And think of how you would have to adjust and try to adapt. It's not quite that dramatic, but people were coming back and they were put into a situation that had developed.
Will you, because I don't want to take anything for granted, will you describe what being bayoneted means?
All guardsmen had bayonets, fixed bayonets on the end of their rifles.
It's a knife.
A knife, a formidable knife, which is attached to the barrel of the weapon. The weapon can be used as a prod on its own, but you put that bayonet up there and somebody's going to get hurt.
Sort of turns a gun into a sword for really close. If you're fighting with bayonets, you're close. That's like a last resort kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
That had virtually disappeared by the time of World War I. That's a long time ago, 1914, 1918.
And these National Guard folks had them like in downtown and on the college campus.
And on the college campus as well, yes. So everybody arrives back, and organizers are trying to organize, and they set up this meeting for the noon time on the college commons, and they were under martial law. And so General Canterbury said, you don't have the right to peaceably assemble. You lost that when martial law came, and He sent one of his fellows in a Jeep with a bullhorn in and around and through the crowd, announcing the riot act. You need to disperse, go to lunch, back to your dorm.
And just as a reminder, the students had burned down the ROTC building at that point.
It was smoldering, just off that common a little way.
And there were reports in the paper that they didn't just burn it down, but they cut the hoses from the fire department.
Well, the fire department did show up and had their hoses cut so they couldn't put the fire out. That's true too. Yes.
So it's contentious. I mean, it's gnarly.
It's gnarly, and I don't think we can appreciate how bad. I've never been in a situation even remotely close to that. Don't know if you have.
No.
So, we really can't speak to it.
Yeah, emotions are high, and it's back and forth. I mean, they're I don't want to use the word fighting, but I mean, it's
provocative, it's contentious, it's mean.
Yeah, yes, there's a lot of bad blood. They don't like each other.
So the students fail to disperse, and the troops are ordered to disperse them in two groups. And one group would ascend what's called Blanket Hill and move the demonstrators to the left of Taylor Hall, which was a brand new building on the campus.
Talking about the National Guard is basically herding students.
It is, and it's divided into two groups to go in two opposite ways around a building, which is up on the top of Blanket Hill. And they force the students over the hill. There's a practice football field down there. The guardsmen go down there and they kneel in a firing position.
How many students at that point, you think?
I don't have
but it's a big number. It's a lot of
Oh,
students.
it's a lot of students.
Yeah.
There's no question.
Yeah.
And others. They're not all students. Here's the other part of this.
The quote I've heard is the National Guard was outmanned and the students were outgunned.
Absolutely. That's true. And they knelt there in a firing position, and the students were unnerved by that, but also took it with a grain of salt because they assumed they were rubber bullets. They weren't live rounds that were going to be in those weapons. As the guard were kneeling there facing the student and others group in the parking lot, at the front of that group, pictured at the front of it, is Alan Canfora with his black flag. And he wasn't protesting the war with that black flag, by the way. He has told both of us that he had lost a friend and he was in mourning. That's what the black flag was.
Yeah, what did the black flag say? What was it?
It didn't say anything.
It was just a black flag.
It was a black flag being waved in mourning for the loss of his friend in, quote, Nixon's war, which was about to expand. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. That's what set the whole event off as far as the people who were involved on the campus felt. The guard got up. They didn't fire. They stood up and they began to retreat back to where they had come from, and they had to ascend the hill, Blanket Hill, from the backside now, if you will. And they got up to the top of that hill, and one group of soldiers, G Troop, stopped, turned, and even though no one has ever admitted hearing a command to fire, one National Guardsman, at one time the fire chief in Ravenna, Ohio, a guy named Larry Schaefer, said, well, the guy on my right fired, so I assumed there'd been a command to fire, and so I fired. 67 rounds were fired in approximately 13 seconds, and 4 students lay dead outright as a consequence of that at Kent State. And I would imagine within a relatively short period of time, you could have heard, at least briefly, a pin drop. And then there was the recovery. What do? You're a student at X university, and you've just witnessed, you don't know all the details, but you at least are well aware that a student or more than one student has been shot and killed by military weapons on your campus, in your parking lot.
This is the United States of America. That's not supposed to happen.
That's not supposed to happen. It shouldn't happen anywhere. But it did happen. I also need to say a little bit of something about something that people that didn't live through that era won't understand, and only the people who lived through it can understand, and that is there was a pall, there was almost a physical weight on the shoulders of everybody in my generation growing up in that era.
I might be able to make a little analogy that might be helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it would sort of be like trying to describe what it was like going through COVID, because that was like a society-wide thing, right? Like the whole vibe of the universe changed during that period. And so describing what that was like to somebody would be tough.
In another 15 years, when some educator someplace is trying to talk about the era of COVID, that's what they'll be up against, because the people who are learning about it did not go through it. There was this weight of this war that was hanging over anybody. And then, of course, as we just said, the Kent State thing happened.
How did you hear about it?
On the radio. And then it spread like wildfire throughout the campus, and there was a furor, an uproar. Some people wanted the school to close right away, which it did. And that made decisions necessary. What happens to my final exams? Do I take my final exams? What does my grade become?
You say, I mean, they shut it down.
Shut it down, literally. Yeah.
Oh, it's May, so would they send everybody home?
Yes. Yeah, we're done. We're done here. Go home. Exactly.
So what happened nationally? What was the...
Well, universities, a lot of universities, not all of them in the country, but a high percentage of universities closed also as a result of what happened at Kent. Nixon had said about the students on the college campuses, they're the luckiest people on earth. And how can they begrudge that?
He called them bums, right?
Bums. That's the term that he used, bums. When I started teaching, it was part of what I taught. I taught a post-Civil War to the present course. And later in high school, I taught a post-World War II to the present course. And of course, the post-World War II to the present was much more detailed than what I was able to do with the other, because you lob off a large number of years and you can focus in. So what happened at Kent State always intrigued me. I wanted to know the details because it had shut down my institution. It was part of the fabric of my life. I wanted to know what happened out there. And one of the books I picked up was a very popular author for that time, and that was James Michener, and started to read his book, and I couldn't put it down from beginning to end. Much to the chagrin of some of the people who experienced Kent State. For example, the sister of Alison Krauss. Her sister is Laurel Krauss, and she detests the book. Alan Canfora, who I invited to come to speak at my high school, didn't like the book. But it was good for me to be able to teach about the class of right and left in America during that time period, which became more and more protracted until really the end of the war. So the parts that I used with students predominantly were not the parts they objected to. They objected to Michener's saying that there were agents, provocateurs, and outside influences that came in, and suave, slick fellows who maneuvered the students of Kent State into a frenzy and then manipulated them and the situation into what happened on Monday, May 4.
You don't have a textbook, but you've got to teach about the Vietnam era, and this is how you did it.
Well, this is how I do it. This is how I did everything when I was a teacher, and that is, if you're not going to use a textbook, the very first question you have to ask yourself is, what will I use for materials? What will these students be able to ingest? What will have appeal? and you go from there. In my research, I found that there was a May 4 Foundation, and this is not the internet era, so it wasn't that easy then. But I found the May 4 Foundation at Kent State University. Actually, it was affiliated with Kent State University. Kent State University didn't want anything to do with it
Yeah.
at the start. And Alan Canfora, this guy, seemed to be at the center of it. And there's a picture of him in that book. And Milton V. Horst's book, he calls Alan Canfora that brazen young man with the black flag. As is my way, that you and I both understand now, I said, I should be able to get a hold of the May 4 Foundation, and if this guy is intricately involved in it, I'll give him a call. And I did, gave him a telephone call and told him that we had a major project going on at our high school. Essentially, and this was in the late 80s, all of a sudden it dawned on me, these kids that I was teaching, they haven't lived through this era.
Right.
So they don't know anything about it. Why don't we run a week series of activities where we bring in people from all genres? I contacted the FBI. They said, no, thank you. I contacted the Central Intelligence Agency. They said, no, thank you. But we were able to find somebody who was ex-Central Intelligence Agency, and he came in. We found an Army planner who was partially in charge of military strategy in Vietnam. I found the Windham County Sheriff, Bill Graham, up in Putney, who'd been involved with anti-war activists. A cohort of mine at the high school at that particular time, a fellow named John Murphy, was a magnificent teacher. The students absolutely loved John. And he taught right across the hall from me, and we were constantly in touch with one another. And any year I got to the point where I was teaching about Vietnam, I'd ask him, do you want to come in and talk to my student? He was a veteran, sorry. Yeah. John was a veteran. He said, no. He refused ever to say anything, as many veterans did at that time. But for this week, all of a sudden, he said yes. He said, I think it's against my better judgment, but I will come in. And he sat on a panel of Vietnam veterans and spoke from the heart about the war. And it was a little shaky for him. He became emotional a couple of times. But when it was all said and done, he pulled me aside in private a couple of days later, and he said, I want to thank you for getting me in. I should have done this years ago. It helped him cope with what had happened in his experience in Vietnam. So we ran that week, and back to Alan Canfora, I asked him if he'd be willing to come here. And he wondered what students were reading, and I told him Kent State. He got himself a copy, and he read it on the airplane, or as much of it as he could, and was not happy with it, as we've already said.
Yeah.
But
it's a huge book.
It is, yeah. It's a long
it's a Michener book. He's
right.
Long-winded, yeah.
Right. And according to Canfora, Michener unleashed an army of researchers, students really, to go out and interview people. So that's kind of the way Michener worked. But he came to BUHS and he spoke, and among the other things that he said was that he felt he was personally targeted because he was visible, because he was up front, because he had that black flag. He figured that the National Guard in their private conversations were saying things like, if we have to shoot today, let's get that son of a bitch. Let's get this guy. Let's get this other one. Let's get this one. By the way, none of the people who were killed would have been on that list.
No.
They were all a football field away. Well, not quite. Jeff Miller's a little bit closer than that, but
they weren't the long-haired hippies that got killed. And Miller was like taking basically a tour, just there. They were all just kind of there, right?
Well, none of them were at the forefront of any of the protests that took place that week.
Right.
A couple of them were somewhat politically active. Ironically, one of them was an ROTC student, Reserve Officer Training Corps. So he obviously was not in opposition to the war.
There's a story in the Akron paper where Allison Krauss, I don't know if it was that day, but in one of those days leading up to, she was a person that put a flower down
one of the guardsmen's rifles.
Yeah.
This happened during that week.
During your week with...
During our week of instruction and inviting people in. First of all, we invited the press. After work, I stopped at Price Chopper, and I was standing in line to check out, and there was a woman who was already checking out. But she looked over her shoulder and she saw me. And she was looking at me with some curiosity. And finally, she felt emboldened enough to say, "Are you that Holiday from the high school?" I said, "Yes, I am, ma'am." She said, "You shouldn't be teaching that stuff to those students. They shouldn't be hearing what they're hearing over at that high school right now." And I said, "Ma'am, I'm teaching history. It happened." But there was a letter to the editor of the Brattleboro Reformer about our contentious week. And the Reformer put this title on it: "Glorious Garbage of the 60s. My heart goes out to the students at BUHS. Why should they have to sit on school time and listen to the glorious garbage of Alan Canfora, Bernard Sanders, Shoshona Ryan, Jerry Levy? People of this nature are turning learning institutions into a spiritual graveyard. Students should be listening to moral and spiritual revival. Our schools cannot deteriorate any more than they already have. The minds of these wonderful young students are still fragile. The youth of America needs to hear words of wisdom, truth, love, and comfort. Wisdom is justified by our children. These young adults should not have to listen to a bunch of burnt-out intellectuals who have absolutely no vision, no direction, and no hope. We cannot deny students the right to live like God-fearing, decent human beings. See how wicked people think up evil. They plan trouble and practice deception. But in the traps they set for others, they themselves are caught. So they are punished by their own evil and are hurt by their own violence." That was Roberta Choate writing to the Reformer about the program that we were running at BUHS.
Will you talk a little bit more about how you organized? How did you get them to do it? How did you put it to them? When you invited people, what...
Oh, okay.
How did you describe the event to them?
When we contacted people, we said to them that we were trying to teach a new generation about the Vietnam era, and we wanted a diverse... The letter to the editor was only about some people that particular person didn't like. She doesn't mention some of the others who represented the more conservative element of American society. But we would say to them, we're going to run this series of events. We're going to invite the press, and we're wondering, would you be willing to come along and represent what the FBI was doing at that time, or what the Central Intelligence Agency was doing that time about these activities, these un-American activities that were occurring. Would you be willing to come in and speak? Just share your experiences. If you don't feel like you want to speak on your own, we can prompt you with questions, whatever we need to do. I will say this, the former CIA agent who came in, we would always request permission to record audio and video. When the former CIA fellow came in, he required us to audio record his session, and then he took the tape with him. And I said, why do you do that? He said, well, you've got the press here, and tomorrow or sometime in the very near future there will be an article in the newspaper about what I said here, and I'll be taken out of context to bend my remarks to suit the reporter and or the journal. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. and he would be called to the carpet, even as former Central Intelligence Agency, by superiors, and he could give them the full context and see that he hadn't violated anything in their protocols.
Who else? So Jerry. So the other people were local, though.
Yes, the others could get here fairly easily. But they were diverse. They represented law enforcement, they represented the authorities, they represented the United States military, as well as people who tried to bomb the draft induction center in New York City. The idea being, stop the draft, you stop the war. And they were very careful to make sure nobody was in that building at the time that it was blown up. So damage was done to government property and the draft induction center, but people didn't get killed.
Were they on a panel? Was there a dynamic between any of the speakers? I mean, you would have remembered right away if there was.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I know Shoshona talked on her own, and Jerry Levy did.
Local
Jerry
activists.
Levy of Marlboro College. He was a professor at Marlboro College and an anti-war activist, anti-Vietnam War activist.
Right.
And Bernie Sanders, that's a member of the United States House of Representatives and United States Senator.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders, burnt out intellectual
from
the 60s.
Yeah.
So Vermont elected a burnt out intellectual from the 60s.
Socialist.
Socialist.
How many times did Alan come back? Did he?
Just that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Alan Canfor came to BUHS in 1988, and subsequently, anytime I taught this in some detail, I would offer to take kids to Kent State, and on a couple of occasions I took students to Kent State University, and Alan met us on the campus and walked us from the beginning to the end. I will say this about Alan also. He was very complimentary of the work we did here at our school, and he was complimentary of the 2 high school groups I took to the campus of Kent State University. In the book, he's quoted about how impressive they were, how intelligent they were, and how involved and interested they were. It was clear that they'd studied and they knew some of the details of what happened at Kent State, and that was very impressive to him. His sister, an activist in her own right, and her name is Chick, C-H-I-C, Chick Canfora. When Alan died, he died very, very suddenly. And so I contacted his sister, and she got back to me. She said, "You're Bill Holliday." I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, Alan mentioned you before he died." And I said, "Who? Alan mentioned me?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Anything he wants, you give it to him." I haven't asked her for anything, but yeah.
She's in the book that I'm reading now. She, the newspaper was in. They were trying to get the names of the people who were shot. Was it the UPI said that two soldiers had been killed.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they got it wrong. The first couple of reports, the Associated Press got it right, and then but the UTI, they got it totally wrong. And the original number, well, never mind. I was about to dive into the minutia. It doesn't matter. They originally said it was like 30, and
there are all kinds of things. There were rumors that there were snipers.
Yeah.
That the students had fired first. All of that's disproven.
Yeah. There were a couple of students that had guns, and the guns were taken and shown to have not been fired.
There have been several investigations, and ultimately, to recent times, to the satisfaction of most people. And it shows that the students were completely exonerated.
Yeah.
The 4 students who were killed outright had absolutely unequivocally nothing to do with any kind of threat of violence.
And one of those investigations was the FBI. I mean, this is what they said. I mean, they said the students did not provoke anything.
Although we've talked about the language,
yes.
But do you shoot people when you're called a pig?
And they're throwing rocks, and yes, it's very provocative. And Chick Canfora was at the hospital. They were trying to get into the hospital to see the victims. She distracted the security guards. She started calling them pigs, and they went after her. And as they went after her, the reporters snuck in, and that's how they were able to verify the identity of those who had been killed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
She's an activist in her own right. She spoke at that 40th anniversary remembrance of the Kent State shooting. Basically, every 10 years, they'd had a major gathering. They invite people back. The 50th, by the way, in which I had scheduled to interview Jane Fonda, who was coming to Kent State, was canceled due to COVID. But I wanted to go to the 40th. And so I wanted full access. And I was thinking, how can I get that? And my solution was I contacted the local newspaper, the Brattleboro Reformer, and I knew some people over there. And I said, here's my idea. I'd like to go to Kent State University with a press credential that would allow me to go everywhere, because certain of the events that they had were only open to the press. But I said to the Reformer, will you give me a press credential? I'm happy to pay you in the form of a series of articles, an article, whatever you'd like me to do, I will do in payment for this press credential. And they said to me, well, what would you like to do? And I said, I don't have any idea, whatever would serve your newspaper. They said, why don't you write an article? So I was constructing the article as I went, because I interviewed relatives of people who were killed. I interviewed 2 shooting victims. I talked with John Philo, who took the photograph we've talked about already. Mary Vecchio, the 14-year-old girl with the Delacroix face, as James Michener calls her, because they didn't know who she was.
Right.
We had earlier said her parents picked up the Miami Herald and saw her picture on the front page. And ultimately, in a phone call with Mary just a couple of years ago, she lives in Broward County, Florida now, she said that she moved back to Florida with her parents, and within a short period of time, it became the same old, and so she moved out again. But I was able to interview all of these people, including Country Joe McDonald, who had shown up to lend his support, of Woodstock fame, Country Joe McDonald. And I wrote an article for the Reformer, and each day I would go into the library, and irony of ironies, the computer I was using had a mouse pad, and it was advertising ROTC on the Kent State campus. It's still there. So one of the objectives of the students in 1970 has not been met. The article proved to be too long for the Reformer, so they printed the first half, and by half I don't mean that I had built in here's a place where you can create a hiatus and people can come back to part 2 or look at part 2 on page 8. They cut it in half by number of words and ran the first part of the story. And I said, oh, they must be running the rest of it tomorrow. They never did.
Oh my God.
That was the story. You can still find it in the Reformer archives online.
You have the full version?
I do, yeah.
All right, well, people can read it by pressing this button.
Right, I guess they can now, yeah.
I want to get to the song a little bit. So what happened nationally? What was the...
Apparently, Neil Young, in response to the shooting, took himself up in the woods, and within a very short period of time, came back from the woods, and he'd written the song Ohio, and he ran it by his bandmates, and they were involved with making and then promoting Teach Your Children.
It's a big hit.
Big hit, but they had to put it on hold because Neil Young and the others agreed we need to record this right away. And the song was Ohio, and it has become an icon of what happened there. Neil Young's song, Ohio, Tin Soldiers and Nixon's Coming, we're finally on our own.
I was wondering about that line.
Yeah, I assumed, always have, that it meant that the government has totally separated itself from this portion of the American society. That's us.
Yeah.
This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. I used to ask students, is that F-O-R, 4 dead in Ohio, or F-O-U-R? And of course, it could be both. It is 4, the number 4. Got to get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down. That's self-explanatory. Should have been done a long time ago. Many of the letters to the editor, written to various newspapers, including the Akron Beacon Journal,
Yeah.
were very sympathetic to the guardsmen, not the students. This should have been done. If we did this all the time, there wouldn't be any protests. If we met protest with government violence, the protests would go away.
Essentially, they're saying if we gave the National Guard the wherewithal to pick 4 students at random to execute, that's what they're saying should be done.
That's pretty heavy, but essentially.
Yeah, well, fuck those guys.
I agree with you.
I read those letters. I'm like, that's what you're saying.
Yeah. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? We had talked about what if we were in a situation like that. We've never been in one, but who is her? What if you found her? Well, Sandy Scheuer was killed, and Allison Krauss was killed, so it could be either of those 2 girls. How can you run when you know? It's time to do something. Get off the fence. Be for, be against. The war went on until April 30th, 1975, so the war went on for 5 years after this.
There's this whole stigma about Vietnam in America, like America had never lost a war, that sort of stuff, and with the pullout. And I always maintain that in hindsight, I don't think America lost the war. I think they lost. I think they could. There was an unwinnable military conflict. You can't win a war against a shooting war against people who are willing to die by the millions. I mean, we talk about. I'm not sure how many. Was it 56,000?
58, over 58,000 Americans
were killed, but the number of Vietnamese killed is
over between 2 and 3 million.
Yeah, you can't win that shooting war. But you and I have traveled to Vietnam, and traveling around there, I would say that overwhelmingly the lifestyle that they want to emulate is the style of Westerners. So I always think of. People say we lost the war. No, not really.
Militarily, it was an overwhelming success, but for the United States. Having said that,
yeah.
What was the strategy? Let's go to Hamburger Hill. And the number of people who were literally chopped to hamburger, thus the name Hamburger Hill. And eventually the Americans took it. To what end?
Yeah.
Okay, what do we do with this hill now? Well, we leave and we go somewhere else. And what happens on a search and destroy mission? We go into a village, we search, we destroy it, and we leave. And what happens? We've created more enemy.
Yeah.
As a consequence. So it was a flawed strategy. Militarily, the United States had overwhelming success. You look at the Tet Offensive, for example, in January of 1968, when virtually every provincial capital was attacked in a concerted, all-out offensive by the Vietnamese. And it was a total military failure for the North Vietnamese, even though for a short period of time, the Vietnamese occupied the American embassy in Saigon. But then they didn't, and they were out. And you and I visited that and saw the gate that was crashed through by the tank. There was a...
Well, that's where the museum is now, right? The Museum of American War Atrocities.
It's right near there. It's not in there. That's now the... what is it? Presidential Palace it was.
Oh, yeah. Yep. There's a quote I think it's in the John Paul Van book, where they talk about...
It's Neil Sheehan's book.
Yeah.
About John Paul Van. Yeah.
And he was captured. He was a POW, and they put him with a kid who spoke English, and they're talking, and I think he's like, we're here to help you. We don't want you to fall to the communists, the Chinese. He's like, are you kidding me? The Chinese? Like, like you see what we're doing to you, the United States of America, the way that you're here coming to take our country, and this is the resistance that you're receiving. We like you guys. We like the USA. We went to you originally because we wanted your help. We hate this is what we do to people that we like who come here and try to take over. We hate the Chinese. Like, the Chinese would never take over Vietnam because we hate them and have for 1,000 years. And that just sort of goes to the intelligence gap of, it's like the CIA, where they're saying, oh no, we need to take Vietnam or else it's going to fall. And they're like, no, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. And it just puts the whole war into perspective. Like, oh my God. It was just so completely pointless.
Well, Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence was a paraphrasing of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
And he asked the USA for assistance, and they basically were not going to help a yellow. And basically, it's a racist response.
7 years after the last American helicopter left Vietnam on April 30th, 1975, China and Vietnam were at war, and the Vietnamese, in a lightning-like exercise, obliterated the Chinese, and it was over.
Yeah.
Almost immediately. Vietnam was listed as having the fourth largest military in the world at one time.
Wow.
I don't know where they are now. I'm sure it's not a factor now.
Right.
You get the point.
They don't need it. Well, they're a Western company. I mean, that's where all our stuff is made now.
Check your table pepper. Vietnam is the world's #1 exporter of table pepper, as in salt and pepper.
Yeah.
And shrimp, we know, from Forrest Gump.
Oh, gosh.
Shrimp. You and I had shrimp at every meal.
Yeah.
Remember the breakfast buffets? The breakfast buffets, they included shrimp.
Quinn, our handler, what did you eat? Ate the chicken head? You remember that? I didn't see that.
I was sitting right opposite him, and anytime chicken was served in Vietnam, they serve it with the head on.
Yeah.
And so he would, as quickly as possible, grab that head. And I watched him do it. And I said, Quinn, every time we have chicken, you grab the head. What is it, a delicacy or something? He said, no. But if you Americans see that, you won't eat anything.
Well, I think once he did do it just to freak us out.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. You weren't far from me. I don't know if you were eating that day.
I think I heard it, and I was like, what the hell was that?
If we'd already been to Dong Ha or not.
Oh, my God.
Remember Dong Ha?
Another story. Another story for another time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Dong Ha.
Jeez. I remember you in that tub.
Did I ever tell you the beginning of that story? The funny part of that was, so we were at the La Residence, which was this the like 5-star 7 diamond.
La Residence.
Yeah. And I went down by the pool, and it was at night.
Beautifully lit pool.
Gorgeous pool. Gorgeous. Yeah, huge, like big. And I thought I was the only person there. And then I heard some like sloshing. And there was it was like kidney shaped, sort of like a bean. So I couldn't see it was well lit, but I couldn't see anybody, but I hear this sloshing. I'm like, what the hell? And I'm just sitting there just resting and feeling a little weird because I'm starting to get a fever. I'm starting to get sick. And I hear this sloshing, it was like rhythmic sloshing, and I'm like, what the fuck? And then I realize around that there's a couple having sex in the pool to the opposite of where I was at. I don't know if they knew if I was there or not, but I was like, what the hell's going on? And then I realized it, and at that point I was starting to get sort of delirious from the fever. But yeah, but that's when all that started. And I'm like, oh, I gotta get the hell out of here.
I remember several things about that. Like, you came down to eat.
Yeah.
You said, geez, I brushed my teeth with tap water. You came down to eat and sat there momentarily and then got up. You couldn't eat. I can't eat. You went back up to the room and
got in the jacuzzi or something.
Yeah, something.
And
I don't think there was a jacuzzi, but hot water and.
Well, there was a jacuzzi in my room.
Oh, you had one.
Yeah.
You had a good room.
Yeah, there was a jacuzzi in the room. There's a 5 of them. There's an incredible place. And I was so cold that when I woke up in the middle of the night, I didn't know what to do. it was air conditioned. It was Vietnam, so there was air conditioning like crazy. So the only thing I could think of to do was turn the jacuzzi up to like hot and get in. And so that's what I did. So I wouldn't, in my frozen state, that was the only thing I could think of to do was get in the jacuzzi.
You remember there was no electricity in the rooms until you got your key and put it in the slot, and then you had electricity.
Yeah.
And when it came on, the air conditioning came on, and the lights came on, and the critters disappeared from the ceiling.
The geckos.
They disappeared. They went flying.
That was in Quang
Quang
Tri.
Quang Tri province. Yeah.
Yeah. That was the Russians. That was like a very. It was built by the communists, and you could tell that place was funny because it was like the best place there.
Yeah.
But the beds, it was like sleeping on a cardboard.
Yeah.
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 All right, we're done.
All right.